Hey everybody, we're back. This time we're talking about civil rights instead of civil liberties. I think this is a very important discussion, one that really cuts to the heart of a lot of contemporary issues in American politics. I wish that we could spend an entire course talking about it, but for the purposes of time, of course we're limited to in pretty much every single one of the topics we talk about this semester, but it's one that I hope that you pay special attention to. If you recall last time, I read a story to you a little bit. We kind of went through the story of Barron and his experience trying to prevent the city of Baltimore from ruining his business. And of course, the long and slow process of incorporation, which has happened since then as the Bill of Rights becomes applied to the states over time. But in this case, this time, I'd like you to take a look, if you haven't already, at a letter that I've posted on Blackboard under the module here. This letter is a pretty important one, and as you read it, I know it's extremely dense. This is written in like old school language. Try to get through this, at least the first few passages of it, and I'd like you to really think about trying to answer these three questions as you read it. The first one being, what is the purpose of this letter? What seems to be the point here? Why is this author, whoever it is, writing this? The second being, what's the problem? What's the issue that the author seems to be concerned about? What's the point of this letter, essentially? And then finally, what are the possible solutions to the problem that is identified by the author in the letter, and what do you think about them? Right? There's a couple of different solutions that the author proposes, and ultimately, we can see that in the Constitution, there's a single solution that was thought to be a really useful one, and that was what was included in the design of our U.S. Constitution at the time of its ratification. And so as you do this, as you read this letter, I want you to think a little bit about this discussion of civil rights at the founding of the Constitution. So we know that the framers, having read much continental political philosophy, all kinds of different thinkers at the time, were thinking about this idea of civil rights, or things that the government can proactively protect, essentially by taking action. We know that these framers were thinking about civil rights, but they were certainly thinking about them a little bit differently than the way that we do now. However, in that Federalist paper that we were just talking about you reading, there are some interesting and very important design details that end up getting included in the Constitution that we certainly want to talk about. The civil rights at the founding that are being thought about, right? Include, for example, rules that govern collective action. So who gets a say? And particularly, as we'll talk about, right, voting rights. Who gets a say? That's a really important question when we think about civil rights. But also we can think about social outcomes, right? The end of the sort of process of governance. Right? Are people guaranteed a Jolly Rancher, right? I say Jolly Rancher here as an example of like a who gets what kind of thing, right? Do people get a Jolly Rancher at the end of the day, or do they not? If we were having class in person, I would certainly be handing those out at various times to promote participation and to provide just a physical example of a good. All right. But Federalist Number 51, I think, has this very lofty rhetoric about these kinds of things. And certainly the idea here is about what happens when we've got this country that consists of, at various times, majorities, right? People who sort of all fall on one side of an issue, and then minorities. I don't mean simply sort of minorities from the perspective of like descriptive characteristics. Right? I'm not just talking about that, and neither are the founders in Federalist 51. I think that if you read this document, you think, oh yeah, minorities, like they're talking about racial or ethnic minorities. That's like not really what they're talking about in this case. They're thinking more generally, more philosophically about this idea of what happens if you have a smaller group of people who have an interest that they're like really care a lot about. And yet there's a majority of people who fall on the other side of that interest, or even don't care about that interest. And so one example I might give to you as another example of being a minority philosophically from the perspective of government, we could think about being students. You all are students. Certainly the majority of Americans are not students. However, you all and people who are at College Park and people who are at the University of Pennsylvania or Penn State, or people who are at West Virginia University, right? They're all students essentially. And so you might have this collective need for certain things as students, like lower tuition, not having to pay so much for college, right? Like help and resources for online learning in today's environment, like not, horrible solutions for debt repayment. All these kinds of things are things that you as students have a particular interest in, but you're not the majority of Americans. And so expressing that interest to Congress, basically, is something that you're essentially a small group who are trying to have their say, relative to a large group that either is indifferent or is actively saying, like, well, back in my day, right, I worked a 40-hour job at the sawmill to pay for college. And all of us, of course, get to roll our eyes and say that's ridiculous. If you worked at the sawmill today to pay for college, you'd still be thousands of dollars in debt. Regardless, right, civil rights are about what happens when we've got these situations where we've got government action to try to protect groups who otherwise would be either trampled or ignored by majorities. And so Federalist 51 is writing about some of the ways in which the design of a constitution, of a government, could help to make sure that minorities are protected, ultimately. And so this rhetoric is very general and very broad, as you can see, right? The idea being that we'll just have a very diverse and large country, and that our diversity is our strength in this setup because, as Federalist 51 sort of argues, we therefore will have very few cases in which the same group of people are essentially always the minority opinion in every issue. So if we've got a country that consists of all kinds of different people, like let's imagine that we've got a group of students who care very much about student issues. You might be students, but you're also other descriptors as well, right? So you might say, oh, I'm a student, now, and when it comes to this issue of student loans and debt, that's where I fall on the side of students. But like I'm also somebody who lives on the Eastern Shore or something. And when it comes to policies about regulating waterways or something, suddenly me being somebody who lives in a coastal community, that becomes the relevant identity here. And so I'm both identities, and yet when one issue becomes important, I'm a member of this group, and when the other issue becomes important, I'm a member of the other group. And so the idea being that maybe philosophically, because we've got so many diverse interests, some days I'm the majority, and other days I'm the minority. It just depends on what issue we're talking about here, right? So like think about do you live in a city or do you live in the country or something, right? Your urban-rural sort of status, or that could also have some impact on whether you find a policy to be useful. Whether you're a man or a woman or you have some other sexual or gender identity or orientation, right? That could also matter a lot in terms of whether you find yourself on the side of the minority or majority on any given day. So the Federalist 51 is essentially saying a more diverse society, a bigger society, right, an entire United States consisting of 13 plus states is going to mean that we get more and better abilities for minorities to sometimes have their say, right? However, right, despite this rhetoric, the founding really doesn't provide a lot of evidence of like strongly protected or like broadly defined kinds of rights. So, for example, right, I need not right go into too much detail about this because this is a story that hopefully many of you are familiar with, right? So, for example, right, the 19th Amendment. And in fact, I've included in a previous module a bonus content link to a podcast that discusses the ratification of the 19th Amendment. It's a really interesting listen. So if you're doing laundry or something one day and you'd like to take a listen to something interesting, check that out. It's the Politics 101 podcast. But if you are not familiar with the story, you may be surprised to know that a federal guarantee on the suffrage for women in the United States, adult women in the United States, was not until 1920. And of course, the interesting thing about that podcast is how that sort of early, suffrage movement, women's rights movement, was also at the intersection of some other kinds of sort of pushes for, increased guarantees on rights. And so even at that time, right, there was still an outcry, even as the 19th Amendment was ratified, to increase the ability of other groups to also have access to suffrage. And so we've had long-standing limits on things like voting, right, all kinds of different rights. And so, again, if we go back to the Reconstruction era, remember the failure of Reconstruction, or sort of this partial Reconstruction, even President Johnson was resisting the 14th Amendment and said, this is, we can recognize that this is part of the Constitution, but we're going to shirk and we're going to fail essentially to follow or comply with the rules of the 14th Amendment. And so we'll find loopholes and ways around this that will allow us to continue to be discriminatory because, of course, at that time in these states, their social order was predicated on essentially a system whereby one group was superior to the other. And it was anathema. It was crazy to think the people that had that power and had that power since the colonial time would be willing to just give it up overnight. And so there was this strong resistance. And really, I think the number one thing that was most infuriating to former secessionists was the extension of suffrage to former slaves. Because again, we talked about in a previous module, this 3/5 compromise that was reached at the Constitutional Convention, this has nothing to do with giving any kinds of rights to slaves at the time. And so even after the Reconstruction era, you can imagine that the stakeholders, the people who had the power at that time, weren't interested in going from a 0/5 compromise in terms of voting rights to a full set of legal voting rights for former slaves, especially because if you think about states like South Carolina, the vast majority of the population of that state was actually former slaves. And so there would have been almost instantaneously a complete reversal of power. And so these people who had that power for that long, right, in this plantation economy, said, look, we're going to lose all the power all of a sudden. And so they felt compelled to do something to preserve, essentially, a system of discrimination. Can you imagine what would have happened if those guarantees had been strictly enforced by the federal government and Reconstruction had succeeded? Think about the kinds of representation that would have existed as early as the 1870s. It boggles the mind even to think about the way that some of these states would be different today if there had been even a decade or 2 decades of substantive voting rights and representation for the Black community at that time. It's incredible to think about. But of course, that's not our history, right? Our history is the opposite. So what I'd like you to do is just try to do this, follow along with the slides. I want to play a little game here. And you can certainly pause the slide, but try to time yourself. I would say try to do this maybe in about 10 seconds per. So go ahead and try to follow these rules. Give yourself 10 seconds and don't cheat, right? Certainly don't. That would be terrible, right? However, I would also warn you to be very careful, because if you were to do this, one wrong answer denotes failure of the test. So try to answer these 5 questions in about 50 seconds time, and I'll see you on the other side of the slide. Okay, what's the deal with this test? Seems pretty crazy, right? A test that's designed to be impossible to answer. And of course, this actually was a real test. I'm not asking you to provide me with your answers in this test, thankfully. But this was a test that was actually given out to real Black voters in Louisiana. And you might be thinking, oh yeah, of course, in 1871 or whatever. No, actually, not during the Reconstruction era. This test was actually given to citizens in 1964, which is really staggering. There's people alive today who would have been eligible to vote at that time, who would have been given this test and then eliminated from the pool of prospective voters as a result of their failure of the test. And so I know that's an extreme example, and I know that's one that is designed with some shock value, right? But essentially, this is one example of a more general phenomenon that we've seen over the span of American history, especially in certain parts of the country. This is basically what happens when minority voting is suppressed, right? The whole point here is to preserve a balance of power in places where there would otherwise be majority minority vote, especially in places like Louisiana, as we've said, where the population of African Americans historically has been quite large in certain counties and parishes, and especially much larger than the white population. And so essentially this is a sordid story, essentially, of de facto limits on rights, where this was given out, and the poll workers at the time who were in charge of those polls simply excluded those individuals who failed the test from voting, and that was that. There was no legal recourse. You can imagine that the person who gets turned away from the poll at this rural polling site is not going to have the resources or means or knowledge to appeal this to the Supreme Court, right? Simply people were turned away, and that was that. Right, but you might think of a little bit about Reconstruction again. This idea of the Reconstruction period and the fact that it was being resisted. And so Congress, which again, this is a Congress that is swept into power, on the backs of sort of this Lincoln Republican sort of moment, right? This abolitionist spirit. Congress is still trying to work as the sort of first branch of government to enforce the Reconstruction agenda across the United States. And so in 1875, Congress witnesses that basically none of the states are complying and says, hey, what we should do? We should actually try to propose some legislation that might, again, increase the sort of teeth of Reconstruction, make Reconstruction more consequential, and especially try to guarantee this equal treatment when it comes to suffrage, when it comes to other stuff, and even really on the basis of just the day-to-day lived experience of African Americans, especially in the South. And so what they did, again, as I've just said, was they created this bill, right? This set of laws, which are not constitutional, but once they're passed by Congress, become the law of the land through the Supremacy Clause, right? They pass laws that are designed to guarantee this treatment, and these are laws that have teeth, in which the federal government it's legal for them to intervene, to go into places and enforce, which means to punish people for failing to actually hold up the equal treatment that's part of the 14th Amendment. And so the Civil Rights Act, I just want to read this out a little bit. Be it enacted by the Senate and the House, so be enacted by Congress, that everybody within the United States gets the full and equal enjoyment of all of the stuff that people like to do, right? Such as inns, like hotels, public conveyances on land and waters. We're talking about ferries. We're talking about, I guess not buses, right? But we're talking about, different kinds of carts and things that can carry people to and fro, theaters, other places of public amusement. Anybody who violates this law, which says you absolutely have to follow this, everybody, black or white, whatever your sort of demographic descriptors are, gets entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of all this stuff. And if you break that law, we will fine you and deem you guilty of a misdemeanor. And that fine, $500 at that time, is a very, very large amount of money. Right? I know we think $500 is a few $100 today, but think about reversing the span of inflation all the way back to 1875. Back at that time, a few dollars could buy very large amounts of something. So $500 is many, many, many tens of thousands of dollars in today's money. So that's a lot. That's a huge penalty for violating this. However, and this is something that, again, really speaks to the idea that this has been an ongoing and constant struggle over long periods of time. Andrew Johnson was actually impeached, which is an interesting sort of minor factoid about this, as, of course, he was resisting the implementation of Reconstruction. But there's a third branch of government, too, as well as Congress and the presidency, who were fighting over this at the time. The Supreme Court was also part of this story, and in a decision soon after the 1875 Civil Rights Act, the law was passed by Congress that we just read, the Supreme Court used their judicial review powers to rule that act unconstitutional. So they threw it out, and they said this no longer applies, this is no longer a law, because we, the Supreme Court, believe that this is actually not constitutional. And so in what became known as the Civil Rights Cases of 1883, the majority opinion said this, essentially. And I want you to really read this text. Pause the slide, really think about this, because this, to me, is a text that speaks such volumes about sort of where we come from in the American context. This was the majority opinion of the Supreme Court, the supreme law of the land, in 1883. And something that I think reverberates throughout American history. The majority opinion included this passage. When a man has emerged from slavery and by the aid of beneficent legislation, by that I mean laws, has shaken off the inseparable concomitants of that state. So basically, when a man comes from slavery, but thanks to the 14th Amendment and laws like the Civil Rights Act, has become free of that, essentially has become free of slavery and the things that are associated with it. When that's happened, there must be some stage in the process of his elevation when he takes the rank of a mere citizen and ceases to be the special favorite of the laws, and when his rights as a citizen or a man are to be protected in the ordinary modes by which other men's rights are protected. And so this I'm floored every time I read this, because what this is saying essentially is, we've had our Reconstruction. Slavery's over. We've provided these de jure guarantees for the rights of former slaves. Is it finally time for us to just allow this group of people to start being treated like ordinary citizens and not special citizens with special rights and privileges? Because after all, right, aren't these kinds of things meaning that these former slaves are being treated with extra special treatment and are becoming like even more important than average people? And if you think about that, think about the test that we just took, right? Think about the fact that this is written in 1883. These people were alive during the time of slavery, the vast majority of these people experienced slavery as, in their own lifetimes. And the Supreme Court comes and says, can we stop treating these people like they're special? I mean, it's unthinkable, right? It really is unthinkable. It's a sordid, I think, reminder of the fact that this was what the stakes were in terms of the resistance to Reconstruction, where people essentially immediately started complaining. We're giving these people special treatment. Why can't we just treat them like everyone else? And yet, literally, only a few years prior, these people were living in the squalor and the literal, they were living in chains. And yet, here comes the Supreme Court saying, okay, let's do away with this, this attempt to have Reconstruction have meaning, because of the fact that now, it's over, basically. We fixed the problem. Obviously, thanks to the de facto segregation and discrimination that was happening throughout the country in the wake of the Emancipation Proclamation, we know that that was absolutely not the case. And this is, again, ultimately a passage that will go down in infamy for the rest of history. There was one guy, John Harlan, who was on the Supreme Court at the time, who was known as the Great Dissenter. And he suggested that maybe this ruling was missing the mark a little bit. And he, I think, expresses what a lot of modern Americans might have expressed at the time. I don't contend that the 13th Amendment invests Congress with the authority to regulate the entire body of civil rights. So basically he's saying, look, I mean, we can't say that the Congress can be so powerful as to dictate every single minute of everybody's day. But I do hold that, slavery was really bad, right? Slavery rested wholly upon the inferiority as a race of those held in bondage. So here, Justice Harlan is identifying the sort of core of the idea of slavery, which was that it was about white supremacy. And so he says, Congress, therefore, under its express power to enforce the amendment, may enact laws that help to sort of dismantle that system, to protect people against deprivation, and legislation may be of a direct and primary character, operating upon states, their officers and agents, and also upon individuals and corporations. So in this case, Harlan says, look, it seems eminently reasonable for the federal government to compel states and even individuals and corporations to follow this piece of the Constitution, because it's in the Constitution. And so again, this is maybe something that makes a lot more sense to us now, but at the time, Justice Harlan was all by himself in making a statement like this relative to the other members of the Supreme Court. So, of course, I want to get us into the 20th century here, but I think that those historical sort of legacies are really important. It's not going to be until the 50s that this system starts to change judicially, because again, that 1875 civil rights legislation, think about that. That would have meant that in 1875 we're sort of preventing some of the principles of segregation from really blooming. Right? The idea was that you could share inns, accommodations, conveyances. Right? So you would not have a Montgomery bus boycott because there would already be integrated buses. You would not have protests like lunch counter sit-ins, right, like in Greensboro, because you would have already been able to sit at the lunch counter if you were a black kid who was living in Greensboro at the time. You wouldn't have to sit there, right, as a form of silent protest. However, that's not the world that we live in. Right? We live in a world in which segregation was essentially the rule of many of these states until the 1950s, and ultimately judicial challenges started to emerge. And so, of course, one was Brown versus Board of Education, perhaps one of the most important landmark civil rights cases in the history of the Supreme Court. Essentially, again, the point of this Brown versus Board decision having to do with the integration of public schooling. And so the majority opinion of Brown versus Board, this passage, I think, speaks to me the most. The most avid proponents of the post-war amendments undoubtedly intended them to remove all legal distinctions among all persons born or naturalized in the United States. So here we're, again, this majority opinion is hearkening back to the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment, saying essentially, this was the point of these amendments, right? Lincoln pressured for these, lobbied for these. The whole point that the abolitionists were trying to succeed in doing was to remove legal distinctions and actually have equal treatment under the laws. That's the whole point of the equal treatment clause, right? And so then it goes on to say, their opponents just as certainly were antagonistic to both the letter and the spirit of the amendments and wished them to have the most limited effect. So this is recognizing, this is like, looking at the writing on the wall and saying, look, it's obvious in hindsight that the people who ruled the 1875 Civil Rights Act unconstitutional, the people who resisted the implementation of the 14th Amendment, the people who instituted black codes, the people who instituted Jim Crow, were trying as hard as possible to not follow the rules of the Constitution. They were being unconstitutional in their practices. And so they say what others in Congress and the state legislatures had in mind. Well, we can't really tell what they meant, really, but we can't make assumptions. But it seems very clear that there were opponents and proponents of these amendments at the time. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And this is a really interesting passage because what they're saying here is essentially we've done the science. There's actually a Supreme Court case in which the Supreme Court heard arguments from a wide variety of experts in education, a wide variety of different sort of concrete material facts about what was taking place in schools all across the country. And they determined essentially that in almost every case, black schools were underfunded, were not being given the same amount of resources, and were producing much worse outcomes than were white schools. And as a result, they said, look, it's a plain matter of fact that these two facilities that are usually right next to each other and serving the same communities result in completely unequal outcomes. They're inherently unequal. Therefore, all the people who are protesting against this, who have brought this case, are by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws. So in this case, they said basically, equal protection is the Constitution. That is what we're guaranteed as citizens of the United States. Going to a segregated black school at this time meant that you do not share or enjoy access to equal protection of the laws. And therefore, it does not matter whether this violates a due process clause, whether this violates anything else. It is immediately urgent that segregation be ended because of the fact that it prevents this. Again, this is the Constitution of the United States of America. If you like it, then that's good because that's the law, right? If you don't like it, then that's not good because you live in a country in which that is the Constitution. And to do otherwise is to violate one of our core principles. And so Brown versus Board is, of course, the sort of first domino in something that this sort of chain reaction that brings down in many places the demise of segregation. It doesn't still, again, solve all the problems. And I think there's a lot of optimism surrounding these decisions. They're a huge, important step. But we have to remember that, again, we think about these constitutional principles, it comes down to the fact that people on the ground, people who are living their daily lives in the United States, need to respect those institutional principles and know that that's our Constitution and again, follow those rules, or else popping up like mushrooms in all sorts of different places, we're going to have discrimination that is in violation of that constitutional spirit, the spirit and the letter of the law. And so one of the weaknesses of the Supreme Court is that they can make this ruling and they can make this essentially reinforce the fact that the 14th Amendment is the law, and yet people can still resist it. And so part of the weakness of our state and of the Supreme Court is its inability to provide enforcement. And of course, many of you who know something about the civil rights movement are well aware of the intervention of the National Guard, for example, to allow black children to attend integrated schools for the first time in many cases. Again, that's where the federal government, agents of the federal government came to resist the resistance of the implementation of Brown versus Board and the subsequent sort of opening of schools in many contexts in the South. So this is part and parcel of American history, but it goes back to our foundational documents. That's why constitutions are so important. So I want to end there today. We're going to talk about citizen movements in another video, and I'm pretty sure that Megan is also going to be providing us with some more information about these citizen movements. But I really want you to sort of think about this. I hope that this was illuminating. I hope that you didn't get the wrong impression here. Go back carefully and pay attention to which of these things became part of our story and which of these things failed, right? So for example, the 1875 Civil Rights Act, sometimes I ask people about this on an exam and they'll say something like, oh, this was great because it provided all these guarantees and prevented segregation from ever happening. That's not true. Segregation did happen. It was a really important and sort of sordid piece of American history. Just go back and make sure that across all these different terms and across all these different decisions, you're aware of which ones had a negative effect and which ones had a positive effect on the implementation of the 14th Amendment. And that's all I'm going to say today. I know this is quite a long video already, but again, I hope that this served as a useful introduction to the sort of subject of civil rights across the history of the United States. And I hope that certainly this isn't the end of your investigation of some of these topics. We're going to come back to all this stuff so much more throughout the rest of the class, and I hope that you keep it in mind as you do so. And I hope that you do some of your own research as well and learn some more things about the details of civil rights movements, from essentially the foundation of the American context to today. So that's all I'll say for now. Have a wonderful week, and I will see you for our next meeting as soon as possible. Cool.